Welcome everyone to this session. So the chair of this session is Pablo Bolt, who is a professor and co-director of the master program on development economics at the National University of San Martin in Argentina. He's also a professor of National University of the West in Argentina. He's tenured researcher at the National Council of Sciences and Technology. He obtained his PhD at the Delft University of Technology. He worked at United Nations Conference on Trade and Development and at the Ministry of Economy and Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Central Bank of Argentina. He published in several journals, including Development and Change, Review of Keynesian Economics, and European Journal of Economics and Economic Policies. He is the author of 2016 book on Inequality, Growth, and Hot Money, published by Edward Elgar. So please welcome Pablo. The digital floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martin. It is one of my greatest pleasure and honors in my professional life to introduce Professor Amit Bhaduri. Before explaining and telling you all this short biography, let me remind you, the session is 90 minutes. Will last for 90 minutes. The presentation is expected to last around 45 minutes. After the presentation, there will be time for questions. The presenter in this session is Professor Amit Bhaduri. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge in 1967. He has taught in various universities around the world, worked on various expert bodies of the United Nations. He has published more than 70 papers in standard international journals. He's currently in the editorial board of 5 journals. He has written 8 books, many of which were translated into several languages. I have 2 of them with me. One is Macroeconomics, and the other one is the economic structure of backward agriculture. So very interesting books, especially I recommend Macroeconomics for sure. He was an internationally selected professor in Pavia University, Italy, until he gave it up in 2009, and has recently resigned as Professor Emeritus in the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. I hope I say that correctly. If not, apologize. He was awarded several prizes for his research. He was awarded the Leontief Prize from the Global Development and Environment at Tufts University in the USA, the Indian Council of Social Science Research Prize in Economics, the Stevenson Prize for the PhD Research in Economics from Cambridge University, and many more. So without further delay, Professor Bhaduri, it's my greatest pleasure to invite you to present. And I will mute myself and I will just tell you around the 40-45 minutes mark that the time for closing. Thank you very much, and the digital screen is yours.
May I start?
Yep, please.
Okay. Well, thank you all the participants. I hope you would excuse my inexperienced way of presenting this sort of visual conferences. I am not terribly experienced with them. I'm much happier with a traditional blackboard and lecture room, but I'll try to do my best. Can everybody hear me? It's okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Now, I would like to begin this lecture from the opposite end of a usual academic discussion. I think we should be a little bit different. So let me start by telling the end of the detective story at the beginning. The purpose of this lecture, as well as the paper on the basis of which I present the lecture, is actually supposed to provoke a discussion among us, people who believe in this kind of Kalecki and Keynesian heterodox economics, and also the wider audience in political science, sociology, so on and so forth, about what is going to be the future shape of capitalist democracies, and to what extent, by using economic theory, we can clarify the fog to some extent. We all know politics is very important. The shape of the beast, whatever is the capitalist democracy, is largely determined by whoever is in the political power at that time. But underlying all this, there are ideologies, and these ideologies have as their bedrock certain kind of macroeconomic ideas. And it is these ideas I want to make it very clear. And for this, I will start with a very, very simplified model, which could be easily complicated in very many ways. Like, for example, first introducing international trade, capital flows, most important, government, which I will briefly introduce at a later stage. But let me start, like all traditional Keynesian, Kaleckian macroeconomics, a laissez-faire, free enterprise, capitalist economy with no government. Let me start there, and let me begin by showing what I want to tell, basically. Now, it's a Kaleckian economy in a fundamental sense, and a bit different from the Keynesian economics, insofar as the class structure is very clear. There are capitalists who earn profit and save only a part of it, and there are workers who consume everything, don't save at all. So savings is simply a part of profit, and this is what gives Kalecki's famous profit equation. Now, this equation is combined with the other equation. I will now need to find my slides. I'm afraid of going out of the thing because I require the PowerPoint presentation. Will you do it, or shall I go back to get it? Hello, Louis-Philippe? Shall I go back to my thing to get the PowerPoint presentation, or would you be able to?
Well, why don't you, can you email it to us, to me? And I will.
I had.
Yeah, so please email it to me and I will put it up on the screen. So I can pause the video and you can email it to me and I will put it up on the screen. Does that work?
Well, I think it will be easier if I, rather than people seeing me, if I just show the.
Okay. Do you know how to share it?
Okay. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. Now, what I do is extremely simple. I take the Kaleckian savings function, where savings is just a part of profit, and the share of profit is H. And if I take Z as the share of capacity utilization, assuming full capacity is 1, I have, this is on the extreme right hand, I have savings. Investment needs to be explained a little bit why we write it like this. It is not just our fancy, we wrote it. There are earlier models, like for example by Steindl, by Bob Rothorn, among others, who tried to mathematize it, where it is capacity utilization Z and also rate of profit. Rather than taking rate of profit, we take share of profit, because rate of profit and share of profit are related through capacity utilization. Actually, Z multiplied by H would simply give you the Z multiplied by H for a given capital output ratio will give you the rate of profit. But this would basically mean if we use rate of profit, not only do double counting, as yesterday it was said in another lecture, but you would also, what you do is something which is very peculiar in economic terms, that you assume all investors to be either, if they have a very high profit share or profit margin, both of which are related with constant labor productivity. If they have high profit share or profit margin, they will not care if their capacity utilization is low, they will still add to capacity utilization. If they have low capacity utilization, if they have high capacity utilization and low profit margin, they will also add to capacity utilization. In other words, the link between capacity utilization and profit is lost. And if you take them separately, you will have it much more clearly. And this is why we avoid double counting, as well as we get the idea that with low capacity utilization, people do not invest. They invest much more with high capacity utilization. Now, this is the first equation. If you take the second equation, you will get, just take total differentiation of the first equation, and you get the rate of change of capacity utilization as a function of capacity utilization with respect to profit share or profit margin. Profit share and profit margin are positively related because of positively related because profit share and profit margin are positively related because so long as labor productivity is roughly constant, which is also another Kalecki assumption. Now, in this case, the denominator is greater than 0 because it is the usual Keynesian stability condition. The savings schedule casts the investment schedule from below. Propensity to save is greater than the propensity to invest if both are functions of capacity utilization or output. So NIC is 0. And from this, we get the Bhaduri-Margolin equation and the separation between profit-led and wage-led. If IH, that is response of investment to profit share, is high, much higher than response of savings to profit share, then you have profit-led growth. If it is less, you have wage-led growth. We know this is a simple mechanics of the model, which now many people are totally familiar with. Now, this model, the way Steve Margolin and I did it, this model is basically different because it actually only talks about the slope. It only talks about the slope of capacity utilization with respect to profit share. It is like the Hicks's IS curve, how effective demand changes as profit share changes. That's on the extreme left-hand side of equation 2. But this slope is a local property. If the derivatives I subscript H or I subscript Z changes, then they will not be then they will not be constant and the slope will keep on changing. It will be a nonlinear function. It can change in any way. If we assume the, what do you call it? If we assume the partial derivatives, that is IH and IZ to be constant, then we get a linear function. And to keep the notation simple, we now assume I subscript Z and I subscript H and I0, all of these to be given, and we get total investment and we get the same savings function, and from which we can get capacity utilization as a function of this equation 4. The difference between equation 2 and 4, which is of some importance, is that equation 4 is what a mathematician would call a global property. Equation 2 is a local property. I don't know why this equation is just going off all the time. Okay. Equation 4 is a global property, 2 is a local property. So we get capacity utilization, which is simply investment by the marginal propensity to save, both of them moderated by a propensity to invest and propensity to save. Now, the interesting thing about this equation is it actually gives you two different ways, and this is where we enter really the model. The rest is mechanics, as I said. Allows us to enter into an interesting discussion. There are two ways in which you can maintain, increase capacity utilization. If you look at the numerator of equation 4, this is obvious. In the numerator of equation 4, either you can increase profit share, H, or you can increase H or you can increase I0. That is, there are two ways in which capacity utilization can be increased. Now, this is unlike in other models because what I'm doing is I'm assuming H as a policy variable or I0 as a policy variable. But what does it mean to talk of I0 as a policy variable? There are two routes we have already seen in equation 4 by which capacity utilization can be changed. One is H and the other is I0. Now, taking these two routes, advantage of these two routes, you can simply see that if you treat I0 as H as a policy variable or I0 as a policy variable, you basically have to decide how does it affect capacity utilization. I found a very simple way by which this can be done. Hold capacity utilization constant and see how much increase in H you would need to maintain the same level of capacity utilization. Or hold H constant and see how much you will require I0 to increase to maintain the same level of capacity utilization. This is our equation 5. Okay. So I take a given level of capacity utilization Z and I rewrite that equation 4, which I have just shown you, as this. It is very simple, except at the very end, I would not use any kind of complicated algebra. So you have from this, you can differentiate with respect to H. Oh.
Professor, do you want us to put your presentation and you can, we'll turn the pages?
Yes, I would have very much liked it.
Okay.
Because
so,
mine, for some reason, is going off and off.
okay, so Maxine, I sent you the presentation. If you can put it up, and if you can take your presentation down, Professor, we will.
I will just close it.
Yeah, just close it.
Positive capacity utilization, the minimum condition, then this numerator has to be 0, H has to be greater than a number. Now, if the I0 is positive, then it is very simple, because the right-hand side is negative, left-hand side is positive of equation 5, and it will always be satisfied. A positive number would always be bigger than the negative number. The first interesting change which I make is that I0 can be negative. That is, you can have what you call disinvestment. Not in the way in which journalists call it, but disinvestment in the sense that any way in which you reduce expenditure on the non-profit driven part of investment, I0, if that is negative, if that goes negative, for example, if you cut down your hospitals, number of hospital staff, if you cut down your number of schools or number of teachers, you will basically get I0 as negative, capacity is going down, and a negative. Then this condition will have to hold. That is, H will have to exceed a certain positive quantity, because I0 is negative. So long as I0 is positive, the inequality 5 I'm just reading is always true. But when it turns negative, profit share has to be higher than a positive number, which serves as a minimum value for a positive Z to exist. That is, if you really do a lot of, and this is the point, if you do a lot of disinvestment in this sense, if you cut down too much, a solution may not exist. You may not be able to have a positive rate of capacity utilization, obviously, because you have negative investment at a very high level. Now, because of this condition that H lies between 1 and 0, inequality 5 can be rewritten like this, where H can be written like this, and finally it can be written like this. Absolute value multiplied by K, KH has to be greater than this, where K is under the Keynesian. Okay. K actually shows you how responsive, because it just shows how responsive IH is to I subscript H is to investment, change in investment or level of investment. And lower is K, lower is IH for any given I0, and therefore lower is the response of profit share to investment. Now, therefore, so for any given level of privatization, I0 absolute value, the smaller value of K representing a weaker profit motive, less likely is the possibility of a solution to exist. That is, if you replace it by this, K, the smaller is K, the smaller would be the possibility, because H will become 1 by K, and the smaller would be the possibility of a solution to exist. This is one important take, because I don't think anywhere in the literature formally, except in the Kalecki's business cycle models and so on. But those are of a different type. How to deal with disinvestment in an effective demand framework is not really discussed. That is, this is the extreme case of austerity which will come in here. Now, let us go to the next slide, slide 4. Now, what I now do is I rewrite equation 4, which was the rate of capacity utilization, for a given level of capacity utilization. I simply rewrite equation 4, which is Z star is the given level of capacity utilization multiplied by the denominator is equal to the numerator. If you totally differentiate, you get equation 6. With respect to H, you get equation 6. Now, this is something which is, once I say it, it's very simple, but it's something which is worth noticing because it links directly with the idea of profit-led and wage-led growth. If the economy is supposed to be on a circumstances such that the economy is on a wage-led path, is on a wage-led growth, then this side is positive. You look at equation 2, if you have slide 2. Yes. Okay, doesn't matter, it's not coming in your computer. Don't worry. Yes, this is, if it is profit-led growth, then this is negative. I'm sorry, this is positive. This is, if it is profit-led growth, this is positive. If this is wage-led growth, this is negative. Right? Now you go to the other one. Yes. This is, you will see, this is the response of savings to a change in the profit share. This is the response of investment to a change in profit share. If this is positive, okay, then what do we have? This must be positive. That is, in an economy where the response of savings is stronger than investment to profit share, that is a wage-led regime, then this must be positive, which basically means this side is positive, so this side must be positive for the equality, which means that I0 will have to increase, and I0 is the investment in welfare expenditure, etc. Okay. Now, we could also complicate this a little bit more if we, and because some people, including, for example, President Trump, I recently heard him talking that, we need to stimulate the economy by making business work, and therefore we cannot have the lockdown and so on. Now, very often it is in an extreme form, it is very often said that if you give sufficient stimulus to profit and increase profit share, you will have even higher incentive to invest, higher animal spirit to invest. This is captured by this elasticity. Rather than assuming this to be a constant, the percentage change in the propensity to invest by the percentage change in profit share, the usual elasticity. If you assume this to be greater than 0, as is conservatives assume, this equation becomes like this. Now, the interesting thing of this equation is this will be negative if this is positive and this is positive, then this whole thing would be negative, because if you divide it by m, for bigger values of m, it will get smaller and smaller, right? If you take smaller value of m, it will get larger and larger, which basically means that this condition, if you just look at it a bit more carefully, this condition can only be satisfied if propensity to invest, if the elasticity to invest, the response of investment to profit share is relatively weak. That is, if animal spirit is very strong, to put it loosely, you cannot you do not require and you will not have social expenditure investment increasing. Now, I need to say something about why I'm talking about this. I have left it as a mystery why what I0 is. I0 is actually the increase in, and this is the interpretation which I wanted you to listen a bit more carefully, which is not algebra. I0 is actually the non-profit motive driven investment. Investment which takes place because of social, social expenditure of various sorts and so on. Now, what is not often realized, I have not talked about government as yet. It can either be private or public. Private expenditure to increase social wage might sound like an oxymoron, but this is not true if you think a little bit of actually what happens. There used to be company wages. Actually, people like Akerlof and Stiglitz and so on wrote paper on this, that if you take yes, if you take private sector, companies used to have wages where they would give labor, carrot and stick policies. They would give them cheap food in the canteen. They would give hospital benefits to their, to their workers. They would give, schooling for their children, so on and so forth. And this would come as a package, as a company wage. There would be a wage, and there would be another part which would be a company wage, so long as you are in that company. In private sector, this was done, for example, Ford and so on earlier, to buy loyalty of the workers. It's a traditional thing. It's a different way of doing, efficiency wage, in my view. But there is another way in which you can think of, if you think of the socialist economies of earlier times, most of the social wage which they got, the same kind of benefit, cheap canteen food, access to schools, hospitals, so on and so forth for the family. They were what? You were employed by a large state enterprise. And when you were employed by a large state enterprise, as an employee of that company, you get all these benefits. That is, it is institutionalized through public companies, public sector firms, public sector corporations, large public sector corporations. But it's the same thing, that it is tied to your employment. There is a second kind of way in which you can think of social wage. That is, you think of social wage as universal, as for the whole society. You can think of social wage as something which is only for the working class. But all these would basically be how you look at social wage, and it will become a part of I0, part of I0. It can be capital expenditure, it can be current expenditure, and so on. Okay. Now, can I go to the next slide? Now, the question really arises now is the central question, I think, of social democracy. I'll come to it in a minute, of social democracy traditional and what we need to discuss. That this one we have already done. I think, I just showed this. That social wage would basically, stick here. That I basically showed earlier that social wage would increase with profit share. This would be only if M, you remember the elasticity is small. Assume constant unambiguously. Right-hand side is unambiguously negative for profit-led case, implying reduction in, if this is negative in the profit-led case, so this will always be negative. Profit share and higher social wage are incompatible in a wage-led regime. In a profit-led regime. In a wage-led regime, where this is positive, only if in a wage-led regime, if M becomes bigger and bigger, this thing becomes smaller. The left-hand side of 8 becomes, in the square bracket, becomes smaller as M becomes bigger, which means your profit incentive increases more sharply with increase in profit share. If that elasticity is very large, M is very large, and that is the animal spirit, farms respond very strongly to profit motive, then you cannot combine this with higher social wage. So social wage and profit incentives are compatible either in a low intensity profit-led regime or in a wage-led regime. Okay, now can we go to the next slide? And I'll be done with the maths very soon. I introduce very quickly fiscal and monetary policy because I want to get to the political, what follows from these equations and so on. I know these equations are boring and probably you do not want to see all of them, but I think I just have to say that these are there in the background. I take the simplest budget, which is revenue, tax, minus expenditure, U. Hold expenditure constant. Now equation 4, that is capacity utilization, becomes the usual equation minus budget surplus. The larger is the budget surplus, lower is effective demand. So equation 10 replaces equation 4, from which you can get equation 11, where BH is simply the additional tax which you, BH is simply the additional tax which you get. If you increase profit share, there is more profit, you tax the profit, but you don't spend the profit. You hold it as budget surplus. It is that. Now this budget surplus, you can see, if you take it on this side, in a wage-led regime, this is positive. The first bracketed term within the square bracketed term, the first bracketed term is positive. I have taken this on this side. If this is positive, this has to be greater than a certain positive number. IH by IZ has to be greater than a certain positive number. That is, in a wage-led regime, you have to have if you have a budget surplus, with this will go a certain amount of social wage. You will have to have some social wage spending to keep the capacity utilization constant, because this minus this is positive. If this minus this is negative, that is in the profit-led regime, where this is the other way around. If it is negative, then this has to be less than a small positive quantity. So it can be still be a smaller positive quantity, or it can be a negative quantity. That is, either there will be very small positive social investment, or in a profit-led regime, or there will be no positive investment at all. There will be negative investment. Now, there are two things which I need to make clear, and from which I will come to my discussion of the politics. The two things which works in this are, one is, you see, this is entirely about fiscal policy, right? But there is a monetary policy which is involved insofar as we have, and as some people have noticed, that if you do a budget surplus for a long time, and if you have a large, I'll just read it out, it's easier. Yes. Okay. 2 points are left out of this schematic. There are many points left out, but 2 points which I want to make. The first one is when we talk about this social wage as a component of I0, or social wage as I0 in the simplest case, we have to revisit one particular aspect of Keynes and also of Kalecki. You see, so far as Keynes's original theory was concerned, and Kalecki's original theory, which was basically that you dig holes in the ground and fill them up, as you remember, and this will create effective demand. And Kalecki said, yes, it sounds absurd, but the absurd conclusion is because my subject is absurd, that is capitalism. But there is something which is left out in these digging holes and filling them up as controlling effective demand. And this is where we need to revisit both Keynes and Kalecki. That what is important is that the composition of budgetary expenditure is extremely important. How much you spend on the budget in defense versus how much you spend on hospital, how much you spend on schools versus how much you spend on beautifying the city, how much you spend on, making your climate better, fighting your climate change, and how much you spend on keeping your rivers clean. All these things are in the composition of investment, which is not shown. And this is becoming increasingly important, and simple-minded budgetary policies do not work. And the second thing about apart from the composition of investment, which is important for social wage, when you include social wage, is the fact that financing social wage through issuing bonds, that if you really continue to have social wage by issuing bonds, for example, if you take monetary policy, issue bonds and spend it on social wage, then you get into one kind of problem, that is bonds are held by relatively richer rentier class and not the pure working class people. And there is a redistribution of income which goes on in favor of old people, in favor of, rentiers in general. And this is something which we should be very careful about. And this is a problem which much of Western Europe has got into. Japan, I know personally, in an absurdly strong.
Professor Amit, Professor Bhaduri, just 5 minutes more for the presentation. Is it okay?
Yes, I'll finish in 5 minutes. Okay. Now, then there is one last equation. Might as well do this and then do this. If you don't hold H constant, which I have been holding constant to simplify the algebra, you basically will see that you can have either profit-led growth, that is, this is positive, or left-hand side, or negative, and this numerator would be positive or negative depending on what your social wage policy is. You can have a negative, this positive, for example, a profit-led growth, this continuously negative, this will become negative, this negative, this continuously positive, this will become positive. That is, by maintaining a systematic budgetary stance over several years, you can actually change regime. And you will remember those two Harvard professors who said 90% debt is the threshold point after which the economy changes, and they were taken to task for, using the data wrongly. Now, much of the political debate about public debt arises precisely because of this. Now, since I have very little time, let me just end by saying, just come to the basic politics. You see, traditional social democratic politics was actually basically what is captured in these equations. It basically said that to increase social wage, if you do not increase the private wage of the wage earners, and this will do. And in the 1920s and 30s, for example, in Scandinavia, it worked beautifully. social democracy made progress. And my favorite quotation is from Olin, who was one of the main architects of social democracy, that our purpose is not to socialize consumption, not to socialize production, but to socialize consumption. He kept on repeating in many places, including in the American Academy of Sciences. Now, the problem with this, and this is what I want to leave you with because I don't have any time. The problem with this basically is that the output which if you do not, only if you want to socialize consumption and not so much production, apart from the problem of increasing taxes and so on, which usually comes in, you have a much more fundamental problem, which I think traditional social democrats did not consider. And that is, if you increase your social wage, that is I0 in this model, if you increase your social wage, the consumption pattern which you need for the poor or for mass consumption is not the consumption pattern which private producers will produce. That is, I'll just finish. If you understand, the socialization of consumption is not the same thing as how much you can make it compatible without socializing production is really the issue which they never faced. They were reacting as the Soviet Union. I will end with a small story. I remember a conversation I had with when a famous Polish economist who is no longer alive died in Oxford as a professor. Bruce met Joan Robinson. We were invited for a dinner. I was a research student at that time. And Joan Robinson was trying to explain to Bruce that you see, you can have the mass consumptions which are socially produced and the luxury consumptions can be privately produced. That is the kind of market mechanism you should look for. And this is precisely which Joan did not see is where the contradiction arises. Because then the profitability of luxury production is much greater than the profitability of other production. I live in India and I see it all the time. That is, it is much profitable to have air-conditioned mall with this income distribution, but it is not profitable to have, for example, simple public schools for ordinary poor people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. The session was scheduled to be somewhat shorter, so we have time only for a few questions. I see that Sherry Curvizanos and Amitava have raising their hands virtually. So please, Sherry, then Amitava, try to keep it short, please. So, and then we'll finish the session. Sherry, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. And I appreciate the technical analysis, but I think there needs to be some precision even in technical analysis. And first of all, in a comment, social democracy as a political process is under attack significantly right now. Scandinavia, the Netherlands, many of them are moving away from social democracy. And the other political aspect is there's much privatization of social production. So now the area that private sector wasn't involved in the social wage is now being privatized. They're just comments. My questions are, first, I was puzzled when you said at the start there was no government, but you had a social wage. So how can you have a social wage if there's no government? So that's the first question. The second one is the concept of the social wage. You have to be precise about what you mean by a social wage. My experience of social wage has been where social democratic parties bring it in, and then as all democracies, you'll have a swing to the right, the Social Democrat Party loses the election and you get a more right-wing party. And the social wage has been a way of limiting wages in social democratic systems. So the Social Democrat Party says, I'll give you social wage if you reduce your wage demands, your nominal wage demands. Then comes the right-wing party. It undermines the social wage. It's already got reductions in nominal wages, so the working class get hit both ways. So to me, you have to be precise about why and how you're introducing the social wage, because it's a Trojan horse for the right-wing parties to undermine working class.
Can I answer?
Shall we collect first Amitabh's
Okay.
questions and then you answer both together? Amitabha?
Yeah. Hello.
Yes.
I really liked the paper because it was both narrow and broad at the same time. But let me be a little critical of it. As follows. One, it is based on Bhaduri-Maglan investment function, which you implicitly said is better, let's say, than Rothon, and you didn't mention my name, but my paper was also doing rate of profit rather than the profit share. I think it is misleading to say that the other investment function was a mistake, because that it involves double counting. I grant you sometimes firms, capitalists might react to the profit share, but it is still an open question whether they react to the profit share or the rate of profit. And it doesn't really involve double counting, because if you go back to your investment function, you interpreted that as, I think, a micro function, but it's not clear whether capacity utilization that firms look at is their own capacity utilization, or if it's the economy-wide state of aggregate demand. So in that case, they need not take into account the fact of their markup change will lead to any particular changes in the rate of profit. That's one point. The second point, this sort of goes along with Jerry's discussion of ideology. I think perhaps you're focusing too much on a criticism of the social Democrats rather than looking at the more fundamental ideological debate between the left and the right. And why do I say this? Because social democracy does not necessarily mean, social democracy does not necessarily mean that it's a public consumption, but it could also involve some amount of public production, and it can also involve intermediate cases like the healthcare system could be funded by the state or insured by the state and so forth. So I think this dichotomy is a little too strong. And also your results about the dichotomy depend very crucially on wage-led and profit-led, as we called it, which is really a debate more about who wants to reduce or increase inequality to promote growth, which is a left-right debate, and not so much. I mean, I entirely agree with you that how you define I0 and its composition is an extremely important issue. There I have no difficulty, but perhaps the criticism of social democracy is maybe not the main ideological debate anymore.
Target.
Thank you.
Well, any more question, or shall I answer?
No, please answer. We are about to close with your answers. We are about to close the session.
Okay. I'm glad. Let me start with the more interesting question. Left versus right. You see, I did not have time to present, but if you look at the right-wing social democrats, if I might put it that way, and the conservatives both would believe in the profit motive, what I call the profit motive, or what I say that, by increasing profit share or whatever it is, profit margin, it will give sufficient stimulus to effective demand. Both the right wing, like in all over Europe, so whatever is left of the former social democrats, and the conservatives would be agreeing to this. What they do not agree on is right to left to, I mean, the mildly social democrat ones would say that, well, you have to provide some safety net, so on and so forth, whose time has also come down. But I think one thing I did not have time to mention, and which is extremely important, and that is, it is a time horizon. Democracy puts a time horizon to show your result. You see, with the profit motive, with the profit margin, it is not clear whether it is tomorrow you will begin to get the result or 10 years later. Margaret Thatcher kept on saying this in many of her speeches, I remember, that, next year we have best trade unions, it will happen. But you see, you are accountable every 5 years, at least in a democracy, so long as the framework continues. And this is not there in a, this is where public expenditure or fiscal policy, not even monetary policy, fiscal policy wins over everything else, because it is something which works within a very limited time horizon. If you want the results, if you want to expand demand, it has to be done in a short period, and this is done there. This also includes the problem of short-termism, which many people have mentioned, but short-termism in a special sense. Short-termism that you cannot choose those composition of investment, again, I did not have time to maintain, which are probably much more useful socially over a longer period of time. Like, for example, improving your schools, improving your hospitals. But you can't do it because you have the limited time of 4 to 5 years. So you can't do this. And this time horizon, I remember a conversation with Steindl in Austria, where he said that I would rather that our social democratic friends, we came out of some trade union meeting, that I would rather have that all our social democratic friends would simply create, and it's a brilliant idea, I think, would simply have a reservoir of projects which they stay in the public manifesto, in their election manifesto, that these are the projects which we will implement, and with a roughly time horizon and the amount of money which will be spent. And so that if you come to power, you immediately start on to some extent, to escape short-termism. And this is something which is not there. I think the debate between the left and the right in a democracy is a debate not about inequality of income. It is much more a debate about what you can produce in your limited period of time, in the 5 years which you have. Now, and the policies which you cannot follow it there, you do not have it. Social democracy is just a metaphor for this. It is, I think, what is really I was trying to get at is that everybody is aware of the fact that the profit motive, if it does not work in the short run, we need an alternative. Actually, you have brought it out of me. If we were discussing for a longer period, I would have said that we actually want the profit motive, if it does not work within a shorter period of time, does it reduce employment, austerity, if it does not reduce within a certain period of time, then we must have the other thing, campaign for the other thing. That should really be the starting point. Well, we can talk about it later. On the technical point of R, R can be broken up, as you know, into Z into H into full capacity capital output ratio. And this is where we started. And I do not see technically how you avoid double counting, because R is simply H into Z into beta, where beta is the full capacity output. But we can discuss it later.
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor. It was a huge honor for me. And thank you for Jerry, Amitabh for the questions, the participants. I thank Louis-Philippe for the invitation for chairing the session, and all the participants in the and presenters in the conference. I remind you that the next session will take place at 11:30 New York time. It will be chaired by Maria Cristina Barbieri Coes, and the presenter will be Marc Lavoie, so you should really stay tuned, who will present a paper, a work on overhead labor costs in a neo-Kaleckian growth models with autonomous non-capacity creating expenditures.